N. Yours. Okay. Yo no aparezco en la cámara, ¿verdad? If you go over there, yes.
Yes, hello everyone, good afternoon. Let me introduce our speaker at this time. This is Dr. Hugo Flores. He's a researcher focused on invitation inverse programs for epidemiology, medical imaging, and microbial communities at the UNAM campus Curitiba. And he graduated from the Universidad de Costa Rica with a bachelor's degree in math teaching. And here, his master's degree and the PhD in applied mathematics in the Centro de Investigación en Matemáticas at Guanajuato, here in Mexico. So please welcome to Dr. Hugo Flores. The talk is going to be modeling glucose homeostasis for oral glucose tolerance test. Okay, so welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here, all for being online. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to share my work. Today, I want to talk about glucose tolerance. I'm going to start explaining why we think it's important to spend our time doing research on this topic, and a couple of questions that we would like to address in our research. First, since we are in the same week, I'm coming from the M branch. I know that there are some of you that like mathematics. I know that there are some of you that like mathematics, but you don't know it. So I will start with our recommendation first. It's a short video. Who is he? He is Vitamin. He is a French mathematician. He won something like the Nobel in mathematics. This is the name is the PhD.
Dr. Flores, can you please come to the here? Then you can appear in the camera.
Okay.
And if you can speak louder, please.
Okay.
There you are. We can see you.
Okay. Great. Okay. I'm sorry. So it's a short video. It's around 16 minutes, and he's a mathematician. He won the Fields Medal, and now he's a politician. So if you think you are maybe interested, please go to the video. I hope you won't regret. So going back to glucose homeostasis. What is homeostasis? So homeostasis is a process of the body. Probably you know that there are some quantities that your body looks for maintaining in equilibrium or inside some ranges. So probably the more popular quantity, you know, is the body temperature, you know? Or your heart rate, or your breathing. Less popular quantities are the glucose levels and the pH. How your body regulates the glucose levels, the short answer is by hormones. I don't know if you have here about the insulin. Insulin is the hormone that allows the body to manage the glucose in the body. So as you may see, the insulin works like a key. You need a lock, and when you unlock the gate, so the glucose can enter the cell. When the glucose enters to the cell, your blood glucose level increases. Now, so you have the insulin, you have the lock, which is the insulin receptors. When they bind correctly, you can open the gate and the glucose enters to the cell. So what happens if you don't have the key?
The glucose cannot enter the cells.
Okay, you cannot open the gate, so the glucose cannot enter the cell. What happens if you have the key, but the lock doesn't work properly? Again, the glucose cannot enter the cell. So, what I just described is type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, when you don't have the key, means that your body cannot produce insulin. The second case, when you have the key, but the lock doesn't work properly, it's type 2 diabetes, and exactly is your body's insulin system. Okay, so there are some different types of diabetes. This is the reason why we think it's important to make some research in GlucoseHomeostasis. It's because we have a big problems on diabetes, in particular in Mexico. We have big problems in this disease. So, how do you know if we have problems to manage the glucose? The glucose in your blood comes from the carbohydrates that you consume. So, to know if you have problems to manage these carbohydrates, there are several tests. Here, I'm going to talk about just one, is the oral glucose tolerance test. It's oral because it tries to mimic the process when you eat. Okay? So the test is very simple. You arrive to a lab after at least 8 hours of fasting, and they take you a blood sample at fasting, then they give you a sugar drink. You have around 5 minutes to drink, and after that, they take more samples or know how your body manages the sugar of the drink that you just took. Okay, so in this case, well, there is a classification here: it's healthy, pre-diabetic, and diabetic. And the criteria just looks at fasting, which is your fasting level, and at 2 hours after drink, you finish the drink. Okay, so in this case, we are taking more samples. We are taking samples each 30 minutes, and for example, here in this image, you can see different data for different patients. So I have one healthy patient, I have 2 pre-diabetic and 2 diabetic. As I said, this classification comes from the level at fasting. This is your point completely at left, and at 2 hours, this is your point completely at right. Okay, you can see the diabetics. There is the magenta and the green one at the highest level, at left and at right. But this criteria doesn't take account of what happened along the 2 hours, just at the beginning and at the end. Okay. So let's imagine that you have 2 curves that describe the glucose level of 2 different patients. When you consider the previous criteria, you may see a fasting at the beginning. You have 2 trajectories, one in green, one in blue, and they match at the beginning. And at 2 hours, what happened? They almost match. So if you just see at fasting and 2 hours, you may think that these 2 patients have similar profiles. But if you see along the 2 hours, so if you take more samples, you can see that there is not similar profiles. So this is one of the limitations that we want to address with our research. The second limitation is what happened in this case here. So to classify you as pre-diabetic, you have a cutoff value. Okay? In this case, is this line in red, 1 point. If at 2 hours you are higher than 140, it means that you have impaired glucose tolerance. Okay. Nevertheless, you can see in this patient that all the measurements are below 140, except for the last one. So what is going on? This patient have real problems to manage the carbohydrates or not? If you're thinking just in the previous criteria that consider just fasting for 2 hours, you probably won't see this situation. Okay? And this is another limitation that we would like to address with our research. Okay. So I will explain the big idea of the approach that we have followed. First, we need something that was named as a regressor. What is a regressor? Is this trajectory here in magenta? This regressor helps me explain the data. Okay. In this case, you can see in equation number 1, I'm writing, okay, the data comes from the values that give me the regressor, but as you may see, the regressor doesn't match all the observations. So there is some error that we can compute for each regressor that I propose. How I propose a regressor? Well, I have a function that depends on some parameters. The parameters is the theta. So when I change the parameter, I have another regressor. So I want to, in this way, I can pick different kind of data. The other thing is that we don't want just one regressor, but just one parameter value. We would like to have several parameter values. Several parameter values that may be consistent with our data. Why? Well, I will explain that in the next slide. But first, as you may see here, I have several values of the parameters and give me several regressors. For each one of these trajectories, I can compute the error. So in this case, I may have a lot of trajectory there, and I need to choose the very trajectory. How to do that? The answer is probability. Okay, and for now the probability, it helps me this error that I'm considered there in the first equation. Okay, so I will explain in general the approach that we have followed. In general, you may think you have a phenomenon and you want to describe. The phenomenon comes from an expert. In this case, since we are talking about GlucoseHomeostasis, the expert is an IT, and he comes with the question. You don't have the question. The experts come to the question and come to the mathematician and say, okay, I have some data here, and I need to address this limitation on my diagnosis. So what it does, the mathematician takes on some pen and you start to write and build a mathematical model. First, theoretically. Then, after that, he must do the computation in the computer. So this mathematical model needs to be discretized first. First, to see if your model describes well the data that your expert are coming. So when you take your mathematical model is in paper and you discretize the model, they may have some discretization error there. They won't disappear, but you can control it. So that is not a problem. You just need to check the theory about it. There are some other errors in the modeling because you cannot describe in a perfect way a biological phenomenon or a physical phenomenon or a chemical phenomenon. So you must propose a model that helps you to answer the question. Okay, just that. And finally, you may have other errors in the observation process, and so you need to, when you discretize your model, you need to take account of all these sources of errors that we have there. So how we do that? So first, you may try to propose a mathematical model, and if you take a lot of details, they may be very complex model. And a very complex model means that you have a lot of parameters. When you have a lot of parameters, you need a lot of data. So you need to do a trade-off there. Complexity, fidelity. But at the end, what you need to identify some quantity of interest to answer the question that comes with the second. Then, as I said, you have this discretization error, this process here, and then it's verification. You have a calibration process. That means that you are trying to find out parameters for your regressor to explain the data. And finally, you have some validation, and that means the other figure that I show that you have several trajectories that explain the data. Okay. Okay. Going back to the specific problem, as I said, glucose homeostasis is pretty much regulated by hormones. There are two types of hormones important. In this case, first is the pancreatic hormones. I have talked already about the insulin. Now we talk about the glucagon. The glucagon has the opposite effect of the insulin. So when you take your breakfast in the morning, take your coffee, your sweet bread, your apple, I don't know, Coca-Cola, I don't know what you take in the morning, and the insulin helps your body to manage this quantity of carbs. What happens if you get delayed taking your breakfast, and now you need to run to your classroom? You're making some exercise, you're taking some glucose of your body, so your blood glucose starts to decrease. So you need another hormone that helps to increase your glucose that you are studying. This is the glucose. Okay? It's the opposite, have the opposite effect of this. The other hormone that we want to talk about is a very important hormone related with the test that we use to diagnose. This is a hormone in the gut, in the incretins. So these incretins helps to secrete insulin before the carbs arrive to your blood. Okay, so this is very important in these tests because you are making, as I said, the tests are mimicking when you eat. So there are other tests, for example, the IV tolerance, the glucose tolerance test, when you have the stimulus completely directly intravenous. So these hormones play a role in this kind of test. So for our research, we need to take account with this hormone there. Okay. Now I'll build my regressor. So I use a mathematical tool that is a ordinary differential equation. I don't know if you know about it, but it works very simple. So I will define 4 variables here that are my quantity of interest. One is the glucose, the other is the insulin, then the glucagon, and finally my 4th variable is the glucose that comes from the stimulus through your gastrointestinal tract. Okay. Now this dot G there is the notation that I use to think how G changes over time. Okay. When I have I dot, it means how insulin changes over time, and I have a variable with the dot, that means. So I will try to propose an equation that explains this, how glucose changes over time. So I must consider what causes a G to increase and what causes a G to decrease. The hormone that helps G to increase will have a positive sign, and the hormone or the quantity that helps G to decrease will have a negative. Okay, so as I say, G increase when your body secretes glucagon because you are doing exercise or fasting, or when the glucose that comes from the stimulus to the sugar drink arrive to your blood, that to your blood. So these two quantities are in red, so they are proportional to the glucagon. It's a positive sign. Then it's proportional to the glucose that comes to the gastrointestinal tract. And I have a quantity in blue that helps me to decrease the level of glucose, either proportional to the quantity of it. Okay, now I have an equation that describes how glucose changes over time. And I know I need three other equations that describe how the other quantities change over time. I have an equation for the insulin, for the glucagon, and for the glucose from the stimulus. Okay, so as you may see in equation 3 and 4, we have a positive part here. How it works, this positive part? It works as a switch, an on-off switch. So that means when your glucose is higher than your basal glucose, so you will put on your switch, and then your body will secrete insulin. What happens if your blood glucose is decreasing, is lower than your basal glucose, so your body won't secrete insulin. So this switch stops. But the switch, the glucagon equation, will be on. Okay? So this positive part here, it works like a switch. And it depends on how close are you or your blood glucose levels from the basal glucose. Okay? So we have other quantities here. In the insulin, your body secretes insulin proportional to the quantity of glucose that you have in the gastrointestinal tract that is corresponding to the incretin hormone that I just mentioned. And these quantities decrease in some exponential way. So we propose this ordinary differential equation system, and my regressor comes from the solution for this system. I take just the glucose to try to explain the data. Okay, how I resolve that? It's very simple. The computer, there are some words that you just need to write the equation. They solve it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I have the equation here. This is the data. I will try to explain with my regressor. My regressor depends on some parameters and depends on time. And I will compute for each value of the parameters the error I have with respect to the data. That helps me to decide which values of the parameters explain the data and which one doesn't explain the data. Okay. Okay, so in my regressor, as I say, there is a parameter there. This parameter is a vector parameter. So I have some parameters here corresponding to some quantities, some rates. So there are rates corresponding to the gastric emptying. There are some rates of how your body secretes insulin. So your body has, as I mentioned, may secrete insulin for two reasons: your blood glucose level or the glucose of your gastrointestinal tract. There may be a rate of secretion of glucagon, and finally, we have a basal glucose level for each one. Okay, so this is the parameter that I can tune to explain my data. Okay, as I mentioned before, how do we do this? We are using probability. Okay, so these parameters there, I need to know something before I know the data about them. For example, the basal glucose level, I know is inside some ranges, around 75 and 110, something like that. Okay, so I will propose some probability distribution based on the knowledge that I have from the formulation of the mathematical model. This probability that I propose, the name is prior distribution. So I have a prior distribution. The idea is with the information of the data, this distribution will change, will be updated to a new distribution. The new distribution is the posterior distribution. Okay? What is the posterior distribution? It's just a conditional. That means that you have the values of theta when you have obtained more information from the data. Okay? And the other quantity here important is the likelihood. What is the likelihood? Pretty much is the error that I said that I compute when I try to fit the data in my regressor. This is the likelihood. This error is this part here, corresponding to the likelihood. And finally, I have the last quantity is the evidence or a normalization constant. So, as you know, in probability distribution, when you integrate the probability distribution, the result must be 1. So, this is a constant that allows you the integral between. Okay. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have several sets of data. And when we do this approach, this is the validation process. So I can see that in our regressor, we can fit different types of set of data. This is a healthy person, but the biphasic profile. What is a biphasic profile? When your data are oscillating. Okay, the second is a healthy person, but with a high peak. It means that at 2 hours, you have a normal glucose level, but inside the interval, you may have an observation that is too high. A healthy monophasic is just a person that is healthy, but the profile is just increasing, reach the peak, and then a decreasing trajectory. There are other, well, this is pre-diabetic patients. There are 2 types of anomalies there. You may have fasting hyperglucose. That means that when you arrive at fasting, you have a very high level, but at 2 hours, you are a normal glucose tolerance, or you may be the opposite. At fasting, you are normal, but at 2 hours, you may have an anomaly. And finally, we have the diabetic patient that are fasting at 2 hours, they are too high levels of glucose. And so the inference works pretty well with the different sets of data. Okay, going back to one of the limitations that I mentioned here, they are the results for the patient that have all the measurements below the 140 cutoff. Just the last one, don't see. And when we make the inference, well, we obtain some results, and we can see that normally this patient is different than having inferior glucose tolerance. The problem of this patient is has an exaggerated glucagon response. So when they take their carbs, they have no problem to manage this quantity of carbs, because at 60 minutes they have normal glucose tolerance. But the reaction of the hormone when the glucose level is decreasing is very hard. So it's exaggerated. response. So why is important to know that? Because the treatment is completely different. So if you just take, again, the initial point and the last one, you cannot recognize this problem. At your right, you may see what I mentioned about, or what I mean about prior and posterior distribution. So we propose a prior, what is red, for the vital glucose of this patient, and the data, what it does, they are translation of the probability. So this data says that the basal level of this patient is around 105, something like that. Okay. Okay. Now we did this methodology with several patients. There's around 60 patients, and we use some of the parameters to make our classification. Now we take for this classification the insulin rates. We have two insulin rates. The secretion rates corresponding to the blood glucose level, and the other corresponding to the glucose in the gastrointestinal. So I have one group of patients. I want to divide in two subgroups. So what we use? Well, we use a support vector machine. You know what is a support vector machine is? No? Okay. The most simple case, the support vector machines are, you have a group, you want to divide in two groups, so the support vector machine draw a line. Okay. Separate into two groups. So we are trying to do that, and we draw a line, and we try to separate the patients healthy and diabetic patients. Nevertheless, we don't want just one support vector machine. Since we are probability distribution for each parameter, so we would like to take account of this uncertainty, this information that we have from this probability distribution. So we apply a support vector machine for all the quantities of the distribution. So you draw a lot of lines, okay? And at the end, what do you have? You have a zone that is limited by the lines. Okay, this zone here represents a transition zone between healthy and diabetic. Okay, as you may see, so these IGT, IFG, IGT, they are pre-diabetic patients. These type 2 diabetic, this data set, we had just 3, and healthy patients are around 40, something like that. Okay. So there are some outliers there. We can see this patient here, it has IGT, it has impaired glucose tolerance, but it is in the healthy zone. You have an idea why it is in the healthy zone? Do you remember the last slide? Can you come back to the previous slide?
It started with basal levels.
Okay.
Isn't it?
Yeah, but this patient here, as I mentioned, the diagnosis of IGT is for this patient here, but we recognize, considering all our samples, the 5 samples along the 2 hours, that we don't have glucose tolerance problem. We have another anomaly. So when you compute the insulin secretion of this patient, that is abnormal quantities. And this is sadly this outlier there in this patient. Okay, so that it means that this patient with IGT is outside the zone IGT because he secretes insulin as a normal patient. Okay. Okay, so we recognize that an IGT patient that probably is misclassified. Okay, when we arrive to the MD says Okay, this is it's a nice exercise, but you have a data set that is short. That you have just 60 patients. I will give you a new data set to see how it works. And we did it again with a new data set, and we validate this transition zone. As you may see, the results are pretty similar. Again, we have outliers that may be explained in the same way as the others. There are situations that at the end, they have no IGT, but they are again exaggerated glucagon response, and we have more diabetic patients there. And again, the zone is actually the same. So the cyan and the green triangles are the pre-diabetic and are the transition zone. What is important here is that in this transition zone, we can find some healthy patients. These healthy patients are the transition zone because we can find some features that help us recognize some anomalies. For example, this high peak that I showed previous slide, that may be an anomaly, or you have a problem at two hours. So this is the value of this transition zone. We are classifying patients that traditionally you will see, okay, you are a healthy patient, but with this transition zone, we can recognize some anomalies in those patients. Since there are normal glucose tolerance at 2 hours, that means that you probably won't need some drugs to help him. He just need to change some habits in the diet and probably okay. What is our current and future work is related with the insulin. So until now, we are talking just about glucose data. Now, what happens if we consider insulin measurements too? So the problem here is you may have patients with similar glucose profiles, but with a different insulin profile. This patient here, the patient labeled by patient 8, have high insulin levels at 2 hours. This patient have the problem that I talked about at the beginning. You have insulin, you have the key, have the lot, but the lot doesn't work properly. So he had an insulin resistant problem, but the glucose tolerance is normal. So if we can recognize this condition here before that the problems of glucose tolerance starts, that will be a success for the same reason that I mentioned before. This patient probably needs just some change some habits instead of taking some drugs. Okay, I don't know how is the time, but that's it. This is all I have for you, and thank you very much for being here.
Hey everyone, do you have some questions regarding the talk?
Can we go back one slide quickly to see why is there such a drastic change in patient 29 after 90 minutes? So that's practically because they don't produce insulin, correct?
Which one?
Patient 29 in the second graph?
Yep.
Okay, so we said patient 8, it's because they do have insulin, but the lock doesn't work.
Yeah.
So patient 29 would be like a diabetes 1, wouldn't be producing insulin. That's why the insulin levels are so low after 2 hours.
No, the insulin works exactly the same. So your body starts to secrete insulin when you take your beverage, the drink, and at 2 hours, if your body works normally, so your glucose have decreased, so your body is not secreting insulin anymore. Yeah? Nevertheless, if you have insulin resistance, probably your glucose levels have decreased, but if your lock doesn't work properly, you still have a lot of insulin in your blood. So the equation in 29 is pretty much normal, but in equation in 8 is you have insulin resistance.
Okay,
Good.
that was my thought.
Okay, do you have any questions? No? The persons that are in Zoom, do you have some questions? Okay, I want to ask you something. What will be the areas that you are involving here for your work? I mean, you were talking about probability, but what else, what other areas are you working with your work here?
Okay, so we propose Bayesian inference. The Bayesian inference is based on probabilities, and other tools that we have used here in the support vector machine is a learning algorithm. And the ordinary differential equation comes from try to describe dynamics, or it may be in the epidemiology or in this kind of process in the body.
Okay.
I just want to answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. And what would be your recommendation? I mean, if someone of these students would like to work in something, maybe not specifically with diabetes, but with an area of researching, what would be your recommendation for them?
Try to enjoy it. Yeah, sometimes the results doesn't appear very fast. So if you are not enjoying, maybe there's the. So try to enjoy what you are doing. Try to enjoy the learning process.
What models do you use? Like, do you use experiments on rats or on humans?
Oh, just it.
And how long did it take you to do this research?
Excuse me?
How long did it take you to perform this research?
This is the science started around 6 years. But I started in the master, and in the PhD, I started with other things. And at the end of the PhD, I made some changes and I get the results. But it was a lot of questions.
And where were you getting your data?
Oh, the MD. So this is interdisciplinary research. So the data comes from a lab, not from an hospital in Mexico City. So our collaborator is an MD, and another collaborator is a biochemist. So we are 4 people. My advisor, that is mathematician too. That I just mentioned.
Do you have more questions?
Just out of curiosity, my question would be, I don't know. The purpose of this mathematical modeling would be then to understand the mechanisms involved in the control of glucose, or it is expected to be used as a diagnosis measure in the future without necessarily carrying the glucose tolerance test.
We don't know yet.
Okay. So totally understandable.
It's easy to talk with an MD and do research, but it's not always that easy to convince a physician to use this approach. So we are trying to disseminate our results, try to build some bridges between the mathematician and this. But we are trying to figure out how it may be useful.
Congratulations.
Okay, does anybody have more questions? No? Then we welcome again to Dr. Hugo Flores. Give him the certificate of his participation. So thank you all of you for coming in today, and then I will see you around. Thank you.